Alright, well my editing skills are crap, but can the same thing be said about Annihilation? Stick around and find out. Hey, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions, here with my uncut review of Annihilation. Let me scroll up here. Okay, I didn't like the synopsis on IMDb. It was like way too vague. Mine still doesn't have any spoilers, but the way I would synopsisize this movie would be: after a biologist loses her husband to an expedition that took him into an otherworldly phenomenon, she chooses to enter the Shimmer, along with a team of scientists, to try and discover what happened to him. Okay, so let's talk about the story, the script, and pacing, and tone, and that kind of stuff. I found this movie to be very unsettling. It's often quiet and slow, but always kept me feeling almost subconsciously disturbed by the ever-present unknown. Now, I tend to get more scared by the unknown. I have some fear of the unknown, and so that's going to have a greater effect on me than it might for other people. But that said, because of that, and largely because of that, this movie was unsettling to me. And there were also infrequent yet effective scenes of sci-fi horror that kept the unsettling feeling of the quiet scenes from ever turning into, say, boredom. The themes and the kind of the type of story that it is, where the horror comes from, borrows from H.P. Lovecraft, I think, in that the greatest enemy is completely unknown in its origin. It is overwhelmingly powerful. Its agenda is really kind of unknown. Its capability is unknown. We don't know the limits of what it can do and not do. And the horror is less about people being torn apart in some kind of bloody fashion and more about them losing who they are physically and mentally, becoming transformed, or in some other way having their essential selves taken away. One character described it like the onset of dementia, but taking physical form as well as mental, and I felt like that was a really good comparison. These characters are not just dying one by one, they're being absorbed, and as a result having their personhood slowly stripped away. There was a subplot surrounding the main character's relationship with her husband that I didn't feel like went much of anywhere, but it was, just this little thing now and then. It didn't get in the way very much. Also, the climax felt a little drawn out to me, and it kind of went from being like feeling unsettling to being strange to me, which I would rather those feelings, of being disturbed, I would rather they would have intensified, but instead the climax felt more on the side of strange than it felt like, I'm uncomfortable, And the movie didn't present much to me that was new in terms of thematic commentary. It did a little bit that I think is either new or hasn't been done hardly ever before, but there was just, some things that I was like, oh, okay, well, I haven't even read Philip K. Dick, but I've seen enough stuff inspired by him that I'm like, okay, we're just kind of tapping into that identity question type stuff again, But there was some other stuff they did that moved, I think, away from what I've seen done before that's inspired by Philip K. Dick. So, and the story had some nice character moments that kept me invested and made it worth watching for me at least once. I don't know that I would watch it again. Regarding the cast, it's a largely female cast led by Natalie Portman, who I thought did a really nice job in this, and the choice to go with a female ensemble cast worked for me. It added to the suspense and horror somehow, to watch women being the targets of this unknown terror. It's not as often in horror movies that you see women being, like attacked by a monster or something really bad in terms of body horror happening to them, that's usually some dude that it's happening to. And so there was something like either fresh or unsettling or something like that about having it happen to women. And so I was like, ugh, that was an effective choice for me. And yet they weren't damsels in distress. They were very capable. The enemy was just far too powerful, as it had been for the various teams of male soldiers that had gone into the Shimmer before they did. Now, regarding the visuals, a mix of CG and practical effects helped me personally invest in the reality of the attacking creatures and the body horror elements, so I really appreciated that. One of the more unsettling elements for me in this movie was the visual design. And it was a subtle thing. It was not like, oh man, this movie has extra gross creatures and extra gross body horror. That's not really what was unsettling for me. It was seeing the various monsters and scenes of body horror through this juxtaposing filter of prismatic soap bubble rainbows. There's always this kind of like slightly prismatic rainbow vibe that's going on in all of the scenes while they're inside this place, this area that has been overtaken by this shimmer effect, And there was something about that just really kind of creeped me out. Images and camera effects normally associated with calming, beautiful, post-rain vistas were somehow made to feel strange and threatening in this movie. So I appreciated that. The discord between the visual design and the horror it represented was a major factor in how this movie unsettled me. All right, I don't always talk about the score of a movie, but it stood out to me this time. The score might have been just as big a factor in how creeped out I felt as the visual elements and kind of like the fear of the unknown stuff. There are no like themes in the music, and there's hardly any percussion at all. Even during intense moments, the score still largely held these sustained notes that grew louder and louder and louder. It was an almost constant background ambiance that gave the movie much of its feel for me. In fact, sometimes there was, you couldn't tell the difference between is this music or is this ambiance. It was so effective in what it did to me that I'm not sure I'd want to sit through hearing this movie ever again. Okay, so I always try to ask myself, is there anything of worthwhile moral, philosophical, spiritual significance, that kind of thing, going on in the themes of this movie I'm taking in that might trigger worthwhile thought or conversation? Well, maybe. I think you could use this movie as a springboard. The movie seems to be written from a naturalistic perspective, which, surprise, surprise, when we're talking about science fiction, right? But it definitely has some spiritual applications and even seems to invite seeing it through a spiritual lens through an early brief conversation about God that, I think probably was purposely put in there just to kind of get the audience thinking, allowing for, spiritual ideas to enter into how they perceived this movie. In this movie, an unknown force is taking any biological material it encounters and is remaking it and blending it with other biological life. When this results in the death of a character, it's said that her mind was being kind of taken and joined with the creature that was killing her. But that's only possible if the mind, is seen as something that is biologically quantifiable, because it was a biological event that was causing that. It wasn't like a non-physical event, and the mind is a non-physical entity. It would have been more appropriate to say that her brain was being taken or copied and joined with the creature killing her, because the brain is made of matter, while the mind is non-physical and even considered by many naturalists to just kind of be an illusion of our brain activity. At another point, a biologist argues that God makes mistakes because the aging process is not actually natural. She says it's a defect in our genes, not the ideal natural way our bodies are meant to operate based on kind of like, well, she doesn't use the word design, but, based on the design. Even naturalists use the word design, loosely in that sense. My response to that is, well, exactly. I think a lot of people kind of get hung up on, if God exists, then why is the natural world so messed up? And I think there's a couple different responses to that. One is that God's purpose, we shouldn't assume that God's purpose is to just make his human pets comfortable, because we're not his pets. We have a more noble identity because of how we've been created, what we've been patterned after, God himself, and what our purpose is, And so it's to think of us as just pets that God is failing to keep comfortable is to kind of miss at least the biblical concept of God. And then also, my next question would be, was aging part of God's originally intended design for humans? Or did something happen to introduce this defect of aging and death into our genes? Despite the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis showing evidence of non-literal poetry form in the original Hebrew, I think we can look there for a strong indication of how this defect became the norm in human physiology. Finally, the concept of one's personhood being diluted and absorbed into a greater entity or ecosystem highlights the rather disturbing nature of, quote, becoming one with the universe, after death, as some Eastern religions present as a positive afterlife concept. If someone finds comfort in the idea of becoming one with the universe, as it's said, I'd like to ask them why they think that would necessarily be a good experience. Why do they assume that will be a good, positive experience? And follow that by asking where they got those ideas and how reliable that source of information is, as a reliable source of information about what happens to us after we die, as opposed to just kind of an idea that we think sounds nice, and so we've decided to adopt that as what we are going to believe. The idea of oneness with the universe might sound peaceful or appealing at a surface glance, but when we start examining it further, I think it falls apart logically, both as a concept and in the reliability of its original proponents as reliable authorities on the subject of the afterlife. All right, well, I have no idea what your tastes are in movies, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, skip for now. You're going to want to experience this once, but wait for Redbox and wait for when you are specifically ready for like a one-time, very just kind of unsettling movie experience. It's rated R for violence, bloody images, language, and some sexuality. All right, those are my thoughts. I'd love to get yours in the comments below, and of course, there's a ton more content and community over at christiangeekcentral.com, so I hope you'll join us there soon as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. Hey, just a reminder that this humble little YouTube channel is so dependent on people just like you. There are 3 main ways you can support this channel, and they're all over at spiritblade.com. The first is to purchase one of our sci-fi or fantasy audio dramas. Second is to give us a donation of any amount. And third, you can become a Spirit Blade insider and get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes monthly goodies. You can get more information on our About page over at spiritblade.com. Thanks so much.